So, good afternoon. Welcome to the spring series of challenges in forest ecology. My name's Douglas Godbold. I host this. We're coming from Mendel University in Brno, in the Czech Republic. I'm sure many of you have seen the series. So today's speaker is another one of long line of speakers that actually needs no introduction, but all the same, I will give a short introduction just to kick the process off. So today's speaker is Daniel Binkley. Dan Binkley, as probably most people know him. As I said, he needs no introduction. He's probably one of the most famous forest ecologists on the planet, I would guess. So Dan is now emeritus professor at Colorado State University. He was, of course, at Duke and at Colorado State University during his more active career, but I'm sure he's not inactive. So anyway, his work has been primarily on forest productivity, nutrient cycling, these sort of aspects. He's published something over about 180 different publications, and I'm sure probably one of the things you know him from are his very, very readable books that he's written about management of forest soils, for example. He is the editor-in-chief of Forest Ecology. His work has been cited over 32,000 times. It takes a bit of doing. And he has one of these incredible H-index for the subject that we all work in of 92. That also takes some doing. So he's going to talk today about spatial ecology of rotational and continuous cover forestry in boreal landscapes. So I will stop talking. I will pass you on to Dan, who will start his screen, and off we go.
So, all right. Thank you for joining in, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. After spending decades in forest ecology, I'm happy to let everyone know who is younger and in the middle or beginning of her or his career that there's a lot left to be explored into the future. So I want to give some background about things we know and things we might ask questions about and where we might go from here. So today's topics, we'll start with some things we all know just to get us on the same page. And then I want to focus on how large are major events in boreal forests. And within that domain of scales of event sizes, I want to talk about local neighborhoods in some regards because most organisms respond very strongly to what's going on locally. But then, of course, there are large influences about what's going on somewhere over there. So we'll look at landscape scales. And then maybe most usefully, we'll zero in towards the end about how we might think about these issues of scale in boreal forests and the changes that happen over space and time, and then what we might do about it. So let's get started. The first thing we know is that if we pick a location such as A in this picture, it'll have some similarities to B, not surprisingly. It won't be identical, but it'll have some similarities. And A and B might be somewhat similar to C, but in fact, they won't be as identical to C as they are perhaps with each other. And even though D is very close to A, it may be less similar than A is to C because the recent history has been quite different between these two locations. We also know that we could define a unit of a landscape. In forestry, we often call such a unit a stand, where things are more similar within the unit than to areas beyond the defined unit. And of course, these patches change over time. The similarities may increase, the similarities may decrease over time, but no place in a forest on Earth stays the same for very long. We can move up in scale and look at perhaps this 4,000 hectare fire. And in some ways, we now have a 4,000 hectare patch on the landscape. But in other ways, it's also a mosaic that contains many smaller patches. And so the idea of a patch that I'll be talking about is not to be misconstrued as something really solid and finite. Depending on our questions, depending on our resolutions, what is a patch and what is not a patch, or where two patches join, that's going to be fuzzy because the nature of the forest landscape can be fuzzy. So we also all know that competition for light shapes forests. All we have to do is look up and see how tree crowns display their leaves to catch the sunlight. But we also know that competition for below ground resources is just about as important as competition for light. 100 years ago, forest scientists around the world started trenching small plots beneath the canopies of mature forests, and they found that the understory vegetation, including tree seedlings, would suddenly grow tremendously better when competition with the big trees that are neighboring was cut off. So even when there's very low light under the forest, we can find that soil resource competition is fundamental in shaping our forest communities. We all know that the majority, or maybe not the majority, but the largest type of forest on planet Earth is a boreal forest. We have tremendous areas to the north full of forests. And the biomass varies from one part of this boreal region to another, typically higher where the climate's warmer. But if we look within a single watershed, such as this one in Sweden, we'll find the biomass variation between stands is just about as great within a local landscape as it can be at a global average sort of scale. So we can summarize this by saying that this forest is not the same as the one over there. Spatial variation matters. And we can say this forest is not the same as it used to be, because all forests do change over time. This is a hard thing to fully wrap our minds around until we begin to look at century-long data or longer. Here's a representation, a colorful picture of the forests of Canada, with the colors representing when a major forest fire burned through a large part of the landscape. The bottom line is that half of Canada's boreal forest burned in the past century, and that's typical of the historical development of these vast landscapes. About half of the landscape tends to burn across the boreal stretch of Canada every century. Of course, that may be increasing in frequency now as climate changes. But the key point here is that vast areas do not remain the same, and these events aren't disturbances that should surprise us. They're events that we know will be coming with big legacies. We just don't always know exactly where or when. So let's dig into some of these patches and events and what we can say about them. So we'll start off in Quebec and Ontario, Canada, and look at the sizes of patches that form in and lead to the development of old forests that are more than 110 years old. So if we look at all the patch sizes of 110-year-old and older forests in Quebec and Ontario, you'd find the average patch size is about half a hectare. That's not really a huge patch, is it? But that's the number of patches on the landscape. The average patch size is just half a hectare. But if we picked a point at random in Quebec or Ontario and then asked how big is the patch we find ourselves in, we're most likely to find we're in a patch that's hundreds or thousands of hectares in size. These larger patches are fewer in number, but if we account for the size that each comprise, then we find that the majority of the area occurs in very large patches. Here's one more way to look at the distributions, and this is what I'll use in the rest of this short seminar. We'll take the same data, and now we'll rank the landscape from the smallest patches up to the largest patches and graph how much of a landscape is found in patches above or below a certain size in these cumulative frequency diagrams. So if we look at Quebec and Ontario and the sizes of patches of old forests, 20% of the area will occur in patches that are greater than 10,000 hectares in size. Again, with the same data and the same cumulative frequency approach, we'll look at the smaller end of the distribution, and we could see that 50% of all the area of the old forest occurred in patches smaller than 650 hectares. 650 hectares is still a fairly large area, but it also means that half of the landscape would occur in patches that were vaster, than 650 hectares. The same kind of graph we can do for forests across Canada and across Russia and ask, how big have the fires been that have shaped these forests? And if we look at the historical patterns on these landscapes, we find that most of the boreal forests of Russia and Canada as a whole have massive fires that spread across tens of thousands of hectares. Zeroing in on just a 1.5 million hectare portion of Quebec, we find that if we're farther north in the boreal black spruce, the patch sizes tend to be a little bit different than if we're a little bit farther south in the boreal mixed woods. But the key point would be that about 5,000 hectares is a cutoff where half of the landscape will occur in patches that developed with fires smaller than 5,000 hectares, and about half the landscape will occur after fires of more than 5,000 hectares. So this is what was going on in these forests when fire was the key driver. Of course, these patches are not uniform, and we can dig in deeper and get some really fascinating local insights that are quite important. If we look at Alberta, Canada, over in the foothills and the mountains, this would be the green line, we'd find that when we have one big fire, there are often unburned patches, maybe 40 or 50 or 5 or 10, within that zone that has been mapped as the perimeter of the big fire. We could also see that if the fire size is something like 2,000 hectares, we're likely to have something like 40 unburned patches within it. But if the fire was so intense that it burned 100,000 hectares within the perimeter, well, then there are not many patches left over inside. So the intensity of the fires can interact with the size of the fires and influence the number of patches left within unburned domains of that perimeter. The boreal shield shows a different pattern than the foothills and mountains did. What this might mean for the development of the forests that come after the fire might be influenced by how far one has to go to find an unburned remnant. And in Western Quebec in Canada, about half of the area of burned forests would be within 200 meters or so of an unburned remnant. So these are some of the scales and the issues of what goes on with fires and patch sizes in boreal forests across Canada, and Russia is probably pretty similar. So 5,000 hectare events are very common, but sometimes 50,000 hectare events and larger happen, as we've seen in the last few years. How about Northern Europe and Fennoscandia? Were fires really that similar? We don't tend to hear about massive megafires in Norway or Sweden or Finland. Well, if we look back at the period a few hundred years ago, from 1300 to 1600, we find that fire really was a big story in the boreal forests of Fennoscandia. In this northern Swedish location, a 60,000 hectare area was examined, and about half of that area burned with a frequency of about 75 years, and about half of the area had somewhat of a longer interval between fires. So that sounds a lot like the forests of much of Canada and much of Russia. If we look at the sizes of the fires that were mapped within this 60,000 hectare area, back between 1300 and 1600, patch sizes were fairly large. About half of the area burned in fires greater than 15,000 hectares. That's a pretty large footprint. But then if we come closer to the present in time, we go to 1600 to 1900, humans were having a very large impact on the landscapes of northern Sweden by then, and the sizes of fires became much, much smaller. But indeed, even during these centuries of intensive human land use effects, half of the area still burned in fires that were larger than 2,000 hectares. Fires, of course, are not the only thing that create patches in our boreal forests. In between fire events, occasional large storms can come along, and they can leave behind impressive areas of blown down trees. There's a storm in Sweden, Gudrun, that tended to blow across much of the southern part of the country. And the average patch sizes there tended to be 3 hectares, but half of the area was blown down in patches larger than 3 hectares. Other chronic processes of individual tree death and falling over can create even smaller gaps. And so when we talk about these large fire-influenced boreal forests, between those big fire events, lots of smaller events are happening that add diversity to a landscape. Insect outbreaks, such as periodic spruce budworm outbreaks in eastern Canada, create gaps, leaving behind living trees in some patches, while other patches have high mortality. And the patch sizes, again, are often on the size of 2 to 10 hectares. But of course, that 2 to 10 hectare patch size can be repeated across very large landscapes. If we look at current rotational forestry in a country such as Sweden, we find that the patch sizes there are not that dissimilar to those that are created from things like spruce budworm outbreaks or windstorms. About half of the clear-cut area in Sweden after 1985 would occur in patches less than 5 hectares, and about half would be in patch sizes up to maybe 15 or 20 hectares. So rotational forestry, as currently practiced in most boreal forests, tends to be down toward the scale of those chronic events like insect outbreaks and windstorms that lead to creation of small patches. Current rotational forestry does not tend to occur at the scale that fires would affect in a single season. So that's the landscape introduction. Let's dive down closer to these neighborhoods, because neighborhoods are where one tree gets strongly influenced by the trees that are nearby, with similar influences for wildlife, perhaps. So on some nitrogen-poor soils, which are common in boreal forests, we often find that when we have an opening, such as girdling of a forest here in Sweden, that the regeneration is abundant in the gap now that the large trees are no longer sucking up the light. But in fact, the large trees' use of the below-ground resources continues around the edge of such patches. And so it's not uncommon to find a zone where the young trees aren't regenerating because of the influence of the large trees. If we look at the picture on the right, we can see that this band with very limited regeneration occurs on both the north side and the south side of the patches. So the influence of surviving neighbors is not just about light in these nitrogen-poor sites. It's largely about competition for soil resources. Here's a graph from another study in Sweden that simply showed the height of seedlings increases as we get away from the adjacent large mature trees that are surviving at the edge of a patch. And the north-facing effect and the south-facing effect are still quite large, and we have to go 10 or 15 meters away from large trees before it seems that the soil resource competition with surviving large trees is no longer important. Now I'm going to dive more deeply into how forests grow because, one, it's important, but two, it's also a topic I really, really enjoy. Here's some data from a single Scots pine stand in Finland. I've listed the trees ranked from the smallest tree is on the left and the biggest tree in the plot is on the right. And this is how much each of those trees was growing on average when the forest was 46 years old. The total growth of the forest was about 7.7 cubic meters per hectare per year. And of course, the larger the tree was, the more likely it was to be growing faster than the smaller trees. As we move forward to age 70, we can see that, of course, the big trees are still growing more than the smaller trees, but all the trees in the forest are now growing slower than they did before, except for the biggest 10% of the trees, which somehow managed to continue to accelerate in their growth. By the time they're 90 years old, this trend has been accentuated. Almost all the trees in the forest have slowed down in growth, but the biggest 5% are growing faster at age 90 than they did ever in their younger lives. This is a really typical pattern for single cohort forests, the kind we create after forest fires or fires that are intense enough to remove the old trees. And we could integrate under each of those curves and figure out what the stand average growth rate is. And of course, the forest has slowed down in growth as it's gotten older. No surprises here. We have many fewer examples in our databases for forests where only small patch events are occurring. Switzerland perhaps has the best data of such kinds of forestry, and so we'll call this continuous cover, where all the events that happen during the period of study are small events. Individual trees are harvested or they die of other causes, and surrounding trees then have an opportunity to gain more resources and change their growth rates. So here we have a continuous cover plot from Switzerland. And in 1963, we'll show the growth of the smallest trees that would be present several decades later. So the trees that are removed or die, we don't include those in this graph. And then the trees that are the largest in 1963, but again, not the largest in the forest, but just the largest of those that will remain decades later. And no surprise, by the time we come up to 1989, the trees are growing better than they were in 1963, largely because the neighbors have reduced the level of competition for resources because they've been harvested or maybe they've died of other natural causes. If we come closer to the present, 2013, the last measurement I had available in the data provided by the Swiss inventory, we can see that the big trees are still growing quite well and the medium trees are getting pretty happy as well. A key difference between these two graphs is all the trees that I plotted on the right side tend to get happier as time goes on because their neighbors are being removed and they get more resources. This is a totally different pattern of development from the graph on the left, where almost all the trees are doing worse next year than they did last year, except for the very small majority of the largest of trees. This is just such a fascinating aspect of forest growth. It deserves some better attention. We'll dive into it just a little bit in the seminar. Again, with a rotational forestry example on the left, a Norway spruce in Austria. If we look at the trees, again, ranked from the smallest to the largest within a plot, we can model how much light each of these trees is getting, and we can look at how much growth of wood occurs for a given amount of light intercepted by these large trees or small trees. So the y-axis is the growth per unit of light used by a tree, and the x-axis is, again, ranking of the size of the trees. Interestingly, the big trees grow better than the medium and small trees, not just because they get more light, but they grow more wood for every unit of light they use. They're more efficient users of light in producing wood. That's pretty cool. The biggest trees use the most resources, but by golly, they use them best. But if we look at that continuous cover forest from Switzerland, David Forrester's modeling has shown that once you're bigger than about 20 centimeters, that efficiency in diameter, that efficiency of use of light drops off. So the biggest trees continue to grow best, primarily because they're sucking up all the light and maybe soil resources as well. It's not because they're more efficient than the smaller trees. This, again, is a huge difference between these two approaches to how forests grow as a single cohort or as a very dynamic cohort over time. And I'd like to show you what happens when we look at rotational forests in general or continuous cover forests in general, but we have almost no research yet that characterizes these kinds of very fundamental differences. So this is one of the major areas that we've left for future generations of forest scientists to dive into. But in both cases, what's going on with those biggest trees really dominates what happens at a stand level. A recent review summarized some of the key points we could take home about continuous cover forests versus our rotational clear-cut based forests. And they said that overall, a selection system with continuous cover may have lower long-term yields, perhaps something like 15% lower production of wood per hectare per year on average across centuries than rotational systems. But what about the effects on biodiversity? Well, there just is not very much information that has exactly addressed the key differences here, especially for individual species that are of high conservation concern. But this review also points out that we're not going to fill in those blank spaces on our map of conservation biology and forest systems unless we invest in some long-term plots that are set up expressly to look at these sorts of stories. I've talked a lot about growth because that's something I've been most interested in, but that's only a small piece of what goes on in a forest that we all tend to care about. Here's one quick example from colleagues at the University of British Columbia. And this just looks at how much carbon is flowing out of the soil from an area that has a set of living trees growing in it, and then a clear cut where the trees are just regenerating. The red color means that the forest is pumping out about twice as much carbon dioxide from the soil as is the clear cut where the new forest is beginning. We could think of our soils as being supported by this carbon flow that comes from the living trees. And everything that happens in the soils is largely influenced by those carbon dynamics. And so when we remove trees, either naturally or with saws and machines, we drastically change the carbon story and every other story that follows on from that below ground. We can think of continuous cover forestry versus rotational cover forestry, but Cindy Prescott and colleagues would also encourage us to think about whether we have continuous root forestry going on in our systems. And if we look at all the various things that happen in relation to edges from one patch into another patch, we can look at something like these gaps created by spruce budworm in Nova Scotia, and all these different lines for the moss cover, the graminoid cover, the establishment of fir seedlings. We can see that these lines are not showing any kind of a singular story. Each of these questions we might ask about what's going on in the forest shows a different pattern with respect to the edge created by the budworm event. And so these edge effects are not anything that could really be packaged into a single effect that we call a single edge effect. Each ecological aspect of these forests shows a different trend in relation to patch sizes, the amount of edge affected area, and the amount of interior area. What I'd like to jump to now, though, is back from those neighborhood effects up to the landscape effects. There are lots of stories that we've been able to create from our research about edges that can look at wildlife and how wildlife responds to those edges. Do moose go out into the open areas? How far from the forest does the moose tend to travel? But when it comes to landscape scale questions like 5,000 hectare fire events or 100,000 hectares fire events, we have almost no data that would cover the wildlife side of our ecological stories. Here's one example from the Yukon about snowshoe hares. On the left axis, we simply have an index of how much hare use is occurring. And on the y-axis, we have years that represent population cycle periods. You probably all heard that the snowshoe hares and the lynx that prey on them go through 10-year cycles across the vast landscapes of Western Canada. Well, if we start the study at year 0, where the population of hares is high, in patches that are 5,000 to 8,000 hectares in size following fires, there were a lot of snowshoe hares out there. If the patch sizes were only 15 to 20 hectares following harvesting, there weren't not nearly as many hares present. And in mature forests, well, there's just not good habitat for hares in mature forests. But if you go 8 years later to the down point, the bottom point of these snowshoe hare population cycles, we find that there are not so many snowshoe hares anywhere. But interestingly, there's not really a strong signal of a hare population cycle unless the patch sizes were 5,000 hectares and larger. So this classic region-wide dynamic that happens with snowshoe hares and lynx may not happen in landscapes that are characterized only by small patches. Here's a similar graph from British Columbia from the same story that now is looking not just at the hares, but at the animals that are predators on the landscape. And a key point would just be that if we look at areas with large patches from fires, that's a place where populations of snowshoe hares can be very large. but it's not the place where the populations of martens would be very large. The martens don't prey primarily on snowshoe hares. They deal better with the kinds of prey that are found in smaller patches or in mature forests. So again, the wildlife story at these landscape scales is never going to be a single story across species. Okay, so that's the hard data background. And now I want to get a little bit towards how we think about scales in ecology in boreal forests. We'll start by looking at the Scots pine germinant, and we can ask, what's the future hold for this tree? Well, it probably holds death coming very soon because most seedlings created in forests die very soon. But if this tree lives to be 100 years old, we can be absolutely sure it's going to be a Scots pine tree. It may not be really large, or it may be huge. We don't really know yet how big it's going to be, but we know what its bark will look like. We know what its wood properties will be like. We know what its roots and mycorrhizal associations will be like, because there are very few ways to go about being a tree with these genetics that is not already well known by knowing that the Scots pine genetics are the only ones available. It's a very constrained future for this germinant. But if we ask the same question about a forest, we find that we've got tremendous flexibility. Not only do we have the genes of a single tree, of a single species, we have the genes of multiple trees of that species, but also often multiple tree species. We've also got the genes of all the understory plants. We've also got the genes of all the wildlife. We've also got the incredible genetic diversity that's down there in the soil. And when you put all those interactions together with genes that can come and genes that can go away over a period of years and decades and centuries, there's no way that that's a highly constrained system. What happens in the future of that forest? We can't predict it with great certainty because there are just so many degrees of freedom in what might come. And now if we come up to the scale of a landscape, not just a single forest, well, then it's very flexible indeed. No landscape has a future that's already been clearly prescribed like the future is for a single tree. So how we think about these sorts of things? Well, the aspects of scale have great importance at scales less than 50 meters. The growth of trees and stands of trees is primarily a story of what goes on at 50 meters or less. The regeneration that creates the next forest is most dynamic at those kinds of scales. The gaps in roots versus continuous root forestry, that's largely a story that'll be most important at scales of 50 meters or less. And most wildlife habitat issues happen there, but not all. Historically, the large majority of boreal forests developed after events that were far greater than 50 meters in scale. And we don't have that much information about features such as wildlife or even plant dispersal when it comes to events that cover areas that are far greater than 50 meters in size, 5,000 hectares or 50,000 hectares. The snowshoe hare example I presented, it was the best one I could come up with in the whole literature, and I couldn't find another one that was even close to that scale in the questions that it was being asked. We clearly need more assessments of these long gradients out into big areas, because that's a big part of our landscapes, historically and even presently with the massive megafires that are coming back to most of our boreal landscapes. I'd also stress that the largest trees in a forest are the ones that have the biggest effects in the forest, whether we're doing rotational forestry or a selection system we might call continuous cover. But what happens in these growth and dynamics of the largest trees probably is not the same in these different silvicultural systems. We really need more research that focuses on the similarities and differences and what goes on with the biggest trees in different silvicultural systems. Here's some thoughts I'd like to see us develop in conversations a little bit today, perhaps, but as time goes by into the future. Forests don't have just one way to be. That Scots pine germinant I mentioned, it's only got one kind of future. It's a Scots pine future. But a forest is never constrained like that. And forests do not tell a single story across landscapes. And a single point in a landscape never repeats the same forest story across decades and centuries. Change is routine. And if forests have so many viable ways to develop, how do we make wise decisions at the scale of stands and landscapes that we're trying to manage and influence? That's the key question, isn't it? So, how we think about things. If forests don't have single stories, then command and control policies and prescriptions may not be a good idea. If we're doing a 6-year rotation of eucalyptus in Brazil, we can command and control what happens in 6 years, mostly. But if we're talking about a century or 2 centuries of a boreal forest, we just cannot command and control what's going to happen there. So what kind of policies and prescriptions do we want? I'm not sure, but they certainly can't be very tight, prescriptive, and defining of a desirable outcome, because that means we don't understand what we're doing if we think that kind of policy and prescription is a good idea. If a single undesired future forest can't be a wise person's focus, we have to start thinking about the undesired conditions we might want to avoid, and maybe how pocket science approaches would let our management activities be learning opportunities. So undesired future conditions and pocket science are 2 topics I also like, and we can talk about them at some point in the future if we'd like, but I can't really go more detailed here. But now if we think about what can we do in the future for these rotational or continuous cover forestry, understanding how these systems grow is going to be really fundamental. And again, the focus, especially on the largest trees, will be most important. We really need transect studies that go from forest edges way out into large domains that were created either by clear cuts or fires or other events. And we really have to know what happens for wildlife and other ecological things that we're interested in and that we care about. This might be a prime area where citizen scientists could be engaged to do these transects. In a single day with a very focused study, we could have people with very rudimentary skills do some very interesting sampling for us by walking a couple kilometers away from the edge of an old forest into a patch. Great opportunities, I think. We also need to realize that if we don't create opportunities for the next generation of forest scientists to get better data than we have currently, they aren't going to have better data than we have currently. We need to set up long-term experimental opportunities to provide information for future scientists and issues. With that, I'll finish the presentation part. Maybe we'll have some good discussions. And I would always love to hear from anyone on email or other approaches, and we can share papers and insights long after today. But for today, I'll stop sharing and we'll turn it back over to the group as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Very thought-provoking talk. Excellent. So we now have 20 minutes or something for questions. Cindy's already has a question in the box before we even got to the end. So as usual, I'll read them because it probably makes it's better for the recording. Her question is: the animal diversity story indicates different types of stands support different animals. Is the optimal landscape one of a mosaic of forest types and stand ages and patch sizes?
With that question, we might expect that I offered to buy Cindy a beer if she would ask it, but in fact, I didn't. This is a question she came up with on her own. And my favorite response to a question like that is, The idea that there might be an optimal landscape is one that I might encourage our colleagues and citizens at large to move away from. What I might encourage instead is to ask, what would be a bad landscape? And I would say a bad landscape would have one species of tree dominating as one cohort across a vast area, because then we can be sure we're not going to have much diversity of wildlife or anything else going on out there. And so that's this idea of managing to move away from undesirable conditions in the future. And so I may not know what's most desirable in terms of patch sizes or species diversity for one species of wildlife or another. But I do know that if we have none of that sort of diversity on the landscape, then we're probably in a very undesirable condition. If we can move towards having a greater diversity of those things, we're probably in a situation that I would enjoy better, and so would many wildlife species. But whether we could actually come up with an optimal mixture, saying the maximum diversity of A, B, or C lead to the maximum diversity of 1, 2, or 3, well, I think that's maybe not the way I'd encourage people to think about our forest landscapes. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, okay. Okay, there's another question. Considering the huge patch sizes seeming natural since centuries, isn't CCF, continuous cover forestry, with minor patch sizes, the most unnatural system of forestry possible? Well, that's a humdinger of a question.
I'd have to say close to it, but then I would jump right away into mentioning that a 10,000 hectare clear cut is not going to be all that similar to a 10,000 hectare fire. And in fact, I jump right after that and say a 10,000 hectare fire over there is not really that similar to a 10,000 hectare fire over here. And then I jump to say a 10,000 hectare fire here in 1900 is not going to be the same as a 10,000 hectare fire here in the year 2025. So given all those caveats, I would say yes, small patch size clear cutting is not close to the spatial scale of historical events in boreal forests over most of the boreal forest region of the planet. But I wouldn't automatically jump to the backwards reasoning that therefore our clear cuts really ought to be that large. And in fact, socially, I'm pretty sure people are not going to want us to go to that scale of rotational forestry. But it is important for us to ask what would be missing in a landscape of small rotational forestry patches that would have been fostered by these very large historic events that were natural. Thanks.
Super. Another question. Are there some examples of long-term, large-scale research projects that you recommend governments, universities, or other institutions to invest in to explore these questions? What are the key aspects of those types of research programs?
Again, a great question. And I don't really know of any that are asking these scales of questions. I don't know of any large research question that asks, if we have a landscape covered with 1,000 hectare clear cuts, how is that different than a landscape of 10 hectare clear cuts or 1 hectare patch cuts? And yet those questions really are very fundamental. So Europe is famous for having ways to encourage collaboration across countries and scientists. And I would suggest that the European colleagues should get together and come up with what these key questions about scale might be, and then what kinds of coordinated research could be put together using existing data or especially future data, what kind of field trial templates are needed, and how can citizen science and other innovative ways of doing research be incorporated into providing that kind of information. So I think it's a very good question. I don't think we currently have programs that can do this, but I think collaborative situations such as European scientists often have could be a great foundation for figuring out what we could do.
Okay, yeah. European Science Organization, yeah, that's a tricky one. Okay, there are no questions in the box, but I have a question myself, actually, first of all. Going back to these big trees, I'm always amazed that one of the things we come up with is we don't know how a tree grows. It's something that foresters have been studying for the last 150 years, and we still don't know really how a tree grows. So my question is, if you look at a stand of where the trees have all started from the same place, which you had, and you have a continuous cover forestry, one is an aspect of the big trees are selected by subtle genetic differences. Whereas in continuous cover forestry, the big trees are selected by foresters. Is that true? Could that be the difference?
It depends on the situation. So that could be the difference. But if we go to Brazil, where the plantations use clonal plantlets, then genetically they're all identical, but we still get this differentiation into somewhat dominant and somewhat subordinate trees. And we still get the same growth pattern of the big trees growing better and being more efficient users of resources. So the genetics may be part of it, but slight microsite differences in the soil may be part of it. But anytime one neighbor gets a slight advantage over the next neighbor, then those positive feedbacks that follow on after that tend to accentuate the differences in sizes. And then whatever those differences in sizes mean, well, then those get accentuated as well over time. But you're quite right that when these selection systems determine which trees will survive and which ones don't, there can be some very interesting dynamics that go on there. But we would think foresters will generally leave behind some very vigorous trees, or trees they anticipate will grow very large. So the fact that those largest trees in the Swiss example were not using light very efficiently was probably not an indicator that they were diseased trees or unhappy trees, because the foresters probably wouldn't have left them behind. So I suspect they were probably quite healthy trees, and there's some other piece of the story going on. And because I like forest soils so much, I'm going to suggest that it's probably a forest soil story that explains why the big trees in that continuous cover system could not be more efficient at using light than the smaller trees. But I don't, of course, have any evidence-informed basis for strong conclusions.
Just to follow up before we go to another question, that's a very interesting aspect, right? Is that you've got a continuous series of positive feedbacks that a tree is constantly acquiring more resources by being bigger. So I'm sure that must be a below ground thing.
And if people are interested in this production ecology of how forests grow and how individual trees grow, I can recommend a great paper in Forest Ecology and Management from 2024, where somebody tried to lay out what these great questions are, what do we currently know, and then what could be researched in the future. I think the senior author was named Binkley or something, so it's easy to find in Forest Ecology and Management. A very nice short overview meant for a general audience.
Super. Okay, so back to the questions in the box. Comparing CCF with RF from a productivity point of view has experimentally designed challenges. Any suggestions?
It would be really tough to design the perfect project here. So I would have two suggestions. One is that the design is developed after conversations with a variety of people, so that the questions that people would most like to answer now, to know the answers to currently, are designed to be answerable in the future, but also to provide a broad context where questions people come up with in the future might be answerable because we had a good experimental design today. So that's piece number one. Piece number two is that design cannot occur only at one location in, say, northern Sweden, because then we wouldn't know what the story would be in Finland, Russia, southern Sweden, or anywhere else. So it has to be a design that is repeated across a variety of landscape situations in order to give us a population of inference that is at the scale at which we want to use the information that comes from the experiments. So I think we could have great discussions of what kind of actual details go into this experiment. But perhaps the biggest point to make is it could never be done at only one site and expect to be very useful to us.
Certainly a challenge for the future, without doubt. Then the next question was something rather specific, is how can patch sizes from the past, i.e. 13 or 1600, be estimated?
That's largely based, when we go that far back in time, on age structures and patterns of ages across landscapes. If we can map how old different units are across landscapes, that gives us some idea of how big the patches were at different times into the past. A favorite set of investigations come from a colleague of mine, Bill Rami, in Yellowstone National Park, where they looked at the age cohorts of lodgepole pine forests, which tend to form as single cohort forests. They could follow that back about 400 years into the 1600s. Of going as far back as 1300. It's difficult to get patch sizes that far back for sure. The fire return intervals are not quite so challenging because then we can rely on the burn scars that are happening on individual trees, and we can use dendrochronology approaches to date those fires. So it's a little bit easier to get confident answers about the fire return intervals going farther back in time than patch sizes. But they are all involving tree ages and trying to map what the sizes of patches used to be.
Super. Okay. Another question. How would you expect the questions and conclusions you have covered here to translate to other biomes, such like temperate or tropical forest ecosystems?
Mm-hmm. I would say that the questions that I approach in the seminar, every single one of them would work everywhere on the planet, and the answers probably wouldn't. If we come down to Central Europe and the temperate forest there generally would not have been 100,000 hectare events. So I'm sure that these sizes of events are probably smaller almost everywhere on the planet than they are historically in the boreal forest. But the idea of what the local neighborhood stories are versus the landscape scale stories, those will remain very important questions, but those answers will definitely be tailored more for the ecological conditions that apply in other places. So in forest ecology, I love to say that the questions apply everywhere, but the answers are always case specific. And we should be pleased with that. We shouldn't be disappointed that we don't have universal answers in ecology. If we thought we could get universal answers in ecology, that would simply mean we just don't understand what ecology is.
We missed the last part of your last few sentences you said, Dan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If
Can you hear me now?
Sorry.
So if a forest ecologist wanted to find the answers that apply everywhere all the time, that would mean she's not a very good forest ecologist because she doesn't understand that in forest ecology, the questions are universal, but the contingencies of local places in time and space mean the answers cannot be universal.
Super, great. Okay. So I can't see any other questions, and our time is nearly up. So anybody got a question? No. So then if not, it just leaves me to thank you very much for a very, very interesting seminar. Thank you doing this for us. I hope people appreciate what they see. And the other thing is for everybody out there, thanks for coming. See you again in 1 month's time when our speaker will be John Healy from Bangor University, and he will be doing something about the Amazon. I haven't got the exact title in my head, but it's something about the Amazon. Okay, so thank you very much. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Once again, Dan, you would like to say something?
One more thing, if anyone wants more details, there's a recent paper in the European Journal of Forest Research that summarizes all of this, as well as a larger report that can be downloaded from the website of the Royal Society of Forestry and Agriculture in Sweden. But the easiest thing would be to email me if you want any more background, and I can send papers, or we can discuss anything you'd like. Thanks.
Okay, I'm sure if you send us the link, we can put it on the Excellencia website.
I'll do that too.
So, okay.
Okay,
So,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.